Mom, I'm in a meeting. Can this wait? The voice was tinny and distant, coming from 5,000 miles away in Dubai. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone to my ear. The smell of German chocolate cake, his favorite, filled the small room. Outside, the morning sun was just starting to warm the windows. I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday, Mark, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. Thanks. Look, I have to go. The line clicked. He was gone. I lowered the phone and placed it on the granite countertop my late husband Robert had installed. A cold knot formed in my stomach, a familiar feeling of shame. I was 72 years old, and my only son treated my calls like a nuisance. It felt like the last thread connecting us was about to snap. The cake sat on the counter, its coconut pecan frosting glistening under the kitchen lights. I had baked it from scratch, just like I did every year for his birthday. It was a silly tradition, I knew, to bake a cake for a man who would never eat it. But it was my tradition. It was all I had left of him. I stuck a single white candle in the center. I lit it with a match, the sulfur smell sharp for a moment. The small flame danced. I sang "Happy Birthday" in a quiet whisper, my voice cracking on his name. Then I leaned in, closed my eyes, and blew out the candle. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. A text message from Mark. My heart gave a hopeful little flutter. Maybe he felt bad. Maybe he would call. I squinted to read the small words on the screen. TX for the B-Day wish. Jen says hi. That was it. Not thanks, but TX. No mention of calling back. Just a short, clean dismissal. That afternoon, I was sitting on my porch swing when Carol from next door walked up my path. She was the head of our homeowners association and took her duties very seriously. She held a few of my letters in her hand. "These ended up in my box by mistake, Eleanor," she said, her voice a little too loud. The metal chains of the swing gave a soft squeak as I stopped it with my foot. "Thank you, Carol. The mailman must be new." She handed them over, but her eyes lingered on my face. "So, any word from Mark? Is he visiting for the holidays this year?" The question was a sharp poke to a fresh bruise. I forced a smile. "Oh, you know his work is very demanding. It's hard for him to get away." I'd been using that same excuse for 5 years. It tasted like dust in my mouth. "Well, I just thought I'd ask," she said, patting her perfect hairdo. "Saw your address pop up on one of those real estate watch list sites. Strange, isn't it? Like someone is tracking its value." I spent the rest of the day in Robert's old recliner, a stack of photo albums on my lap. The worn velvet of the armrests felt comforting under my hands. I flipped through the stiff, crinkling pages. There was Mark, as a little boy, with a gap-toothed grin, holding up a string of fish. Mark, in his high school graduation cap, looking so proud. I found a picture of Robert with his arm around him. I could almost hear my husband's voice, that low rumble he had. "That boy will do great things, Eleanor," he used to say. But he needs to remember where he came from. The memories were warm, like sun on my skin. But now they had a bitter edge. I saw a photo of Mark and his wife, Jennifer, at our 40th anniversary party just before they moved. He was smiling, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, at something far away. I closed the album with a soft thud. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived. It was from Medicare, full of papers about supplemental insurance. I spread them out on the kitchen table. The tiny print swam before my eyes. Deductibles, co-pays, networks. It was a foreign language. Years ago, I would have just called Mark. He was good with computers and paperwork. He would have sorted it all out for me in 10 minutes. I felt a wave of frustration so strong it made my chest tight. It wasn't just about the forms, it was the loneliness of it all, the feeling of being completely on my own. The air conditioner hummed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silent house. I gathered up the confusing papers, folded them into a messy bundle, and pushed them into the junk drawer next to the stove. I'd deal with them later. The drawer closed with a sound like a gavel. My weekly church group met in the fellowship hall. The air was thick with the smell of brewing coffee and Mrs. Gable's tuna noodle casserole. The theme for our discussion that week was family. I stirred my weak coffee with a plastic spoon and listened. Margaret proudly showed pictures of her new grandson. Linda talked about her son flying in to help her with storm windows. "And what about you, Eleanor?" Margaret asked. "Is Mark coming for Christmas this year?" I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me. I tried to smile, but my face felt stiff. "He's just so busy with his work in Dubai," I said, the same old lie. I felt like a ghost at the table, a faded photograph of a mother. That's when it happened. A sudden, sharp pain bloomed in my chest, like a hot needle. The room tilted, and the friendly faces around me blurred. I told myself it was just indigestion from the casserole. I didn't want to be a bother, so I drove myself home and took an antacid. The next morning, the pain was a dull ache, easy to ignore. I went about my routine. I watered my rose bushes, the cool mist from the hose dampening my slippers. The smell of the wet earth always calmed me. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table to pay my bills. My social security check didn't leave much room for extras, but I was careful. I sorted through the small stack of envelopes. Tucked between a gas bill and a catalogue was a bright red envelope from the county tax office. It was a past due notice for my property tax. My breath caught in my throat. I had sent Mark the money to pay it online 3 months ago. My hand trembled a little as I dialed Mark's number. It went straight to his voicemail, the same cheerful, professional recording I hadn't been able to get past for 5 years. I hung up and sent him a text message. My fingers felt clumsy on the little screen. "Got a past due notice for the property tax. Did you forget to pay it?" The reply came back almost instantly. The little bubble popped up on my screen, so fast it made my heart jump. But the words were cold. "Don't have time. Just pay the late fee. Send me the login stuff again. I'll do it later." He hadn't forgotten. He just hadn't done it. And he still had the money. The chest pain came back that afternoon, and this time it was a giant fist squeezing my heart. It took my breath away. I stumbled in the living room, reaching for the telephone on the end table. My fingers brushed the cool plastic receiver, and then the world went dark. My last thought was a strange one. Mark would be so angry about all this fuss. I learned later that my neighbour, Carol, had been on her daily HOA patrol. She noticed my leaves weren't raked, a clear violation of the autumn bylaws. She came over to give me a friendly little warning, peered through the living room window, and saw me crumpled on the floral carpet. She's the one who called 911. I woke up to the steady, rhythmic beeping of a machine. The room was white and smelled of antiseptic. A doctor with a kind face told me I'd had a mild heart attack. He said I was very lucky. My cell phone was on the bedside table, placed there by a thoughtful paramedic. The screen was lit up with notifications. For a moment, my heart soared with a foolish hope. He must have heard. He must have called. I picked up the phone. There were 3 missed calls from Carol, a dozen texts from the church prayer chain, a reminder from the pharmacy that my blood pressure prescription was ready. I scrolled through every single notification. Not one was from my son. A young woman in blue scrubs came in, quiet as a mouse. The name on her badge said Sarah. She had a kind face and hands that were gentle when she checked my blood pressure. The cuff squeezed my arm with a soft, whirring sound. "Everything looks good, Eleanor," she said. Her voice was like warm tea. She glanced at the tray beside my bed. The jello was untouched. The broth was cold. "You're not hungry?" she asked. She didn't sound annoyed, just concerned. I shook my head. "It all tastes like cardboard." She smiled a little. "Hospital food? I can sneak you a ginger ale from the staff fridge if you like. Sometimes that helps." A simple offer. A can of soda. But after years of feeling like a bother, that small kindness felt so big it made my throat ache. I just nodded, because I was afraid if I spoke, I would cry. My neighbour Carol must have posted something on her Facebook page. A little prayer request, I suppose. She loved being the first with any news. My phone, sitting on the bedside table, started buzzing. Then it buzzed again. My heart did a funny little jump. Maybe it was Mark. Maybe someone had finally gotten through to him. I reached for the phone with a shaky hand. The screen lit up with a message notification. His name was right there. Mark. For the first time in 5 years, he had reached out first. Hope is a foolish, stubborn thing. I opened the message. There were no questions about how I was feeling. No, "I'm sorry to hear you're sick." Just a few cold words on the screen. "Carol said you're in the hospital. Is the will up to date? We need to talk about the house." The air left my lungs in a sharp gasp. The heart monitor next to my bed started beeping a little faster, a frantic little rhythm of my own betrayal. I didn't reply to his message. I just turned the phone over, so the screen was dark. I stared at the white acoustic tiles on the ceiling. Each one had tiny, pointless holes in it. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. Anything to keep from thinking. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence. For 5 years, I was a voice on his voicemail. In the hospital, I suddenly became an estate. Sarah came back in with the can of ginger ale. It was cold against my palm. She saw the look on my face. She saw the single tear that escaped and slid down my temple into my hair. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just pulled the visitor's chair closer, sat down, and gently took my free hand. "It's okay to be upset," she said softly. Her hand was warm and strong around mine. Her presence was a comfort that asked for nothing in return. After Sarah's shift ended, I lay there in the quiet dark. The lights from the hallway made a pale yellow line under my door. I thought about Mark's words. "We need to talk about the house. My house." The house Robert and I had filled with photo albums and the smell of baking bread. A feeling started in my stomach, cold and hard like a river stone. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was something else. It was anger. The next morning, when Sarah came in, I had a request. "Can you find me a pen?" I asked. "And a piece of paper. A clipboard, maybe." She brought them right away. I sat up straighter against the pillows. I started to write. First, the house. Paid off. Then Robert's pension, which came to me, my social security. The savings account I barely touched. The investment bonds Robert had bought 30 years ago. As the list grew, I felt a strange shift inside me. These weren't just numbers. This was my life, my security. And my son saw it as nothing more than his future paycheck. My old lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, had retired to Florida years ago. He'd sent me a Christmas card every year, with a picture of him holding a ridiculously large fish. I had no idea who to call now. The thought of finding someone new, of explaining everything, was exhausting. When Sarah came to check my blood pressure again, I took a chance. "Sarah," I said, my voice a little hoarse. This might be a strange question, but do you happen to know a good lawyer? She looked surprised. My uncle, actually. He's an estate lawyer. Very sharp. Why? Is everything okay? I just need to update some paperwork, I said. The biggest understatement of my life. Would you mind? Could you call him for me? She nodded, pulling out her own phone. As she was dialing, my phone on the nightstand buzzed again. Another message from Mark. Mum, ignoring me won't help. We need to be practical about this. The lawyer, a woman named Ms. Davis, came the next afternoon. She wasn't at all like old Mr. Abernathy. She wore a sharp blue suit and carried a thin leather briefcase. The hospital room suddenly felt like a boardroom. The air still smelled faintly of antiseptic, but her perfume was crisp, like green apples. She sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair and got right to the point. Your rights are very clear, Mrs. Vance, she said, her voice calm and steady. As long as you are of sound mind, you can change your will at any time, for any reason. And how do we prove I'm of sound mind? I asked. My own voice felt thin, like a worn-out sheet. Your doctor can provide a statement, she said. I spoke with Dr. Miller on my way in. He says you're perfectly lucid. She gave me a small, professional smile. He said you're sharp as a tack. A plan, which had been a fuzzy, angry cloud in my head, started to take shape. It was cold and clear and a little bit terrifying. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't pain or sadness. It was purpose. Sarah, I said that evening when she came in to check my blood pressure. The cuff squeezed my arm with a soft hiss. Could you do me a very big favor? Of course, Eleanor, she said, scribbling on my chart. In the drawer of my bedside table at home, there's a small brass key. Could you bring it to me tomorrow? I described the table, the one with the water ring from my late husband's glass. She came back the next day with the key on her lunch break. It felt heavy and important in my palm. I asked her to open the small lockbox I kept in the hospital safe. Inside were the papers that held my entire life. The original will, the deed to the house, and Robert's old investment statements. I spread them out on the scratchy hospital blanket. The paper was cool and smooth under my fingertips. Holding the deed, I thought about the decades of living inside those walls. A cold, hard thought settled in my mind then, clear as a church bell on a winter morning. I didn't die in this hospital bed. I just stopped being convenient. Ms. Davis returned the following morning. The sun streamed through the window, making dust motes dance in the air. We went over every single account, every policy. She made neat little notes on a yellow legal pad. All right, Eleanor, she said finally, putting her pen down. We have a full picture. What is it you want to do? I took a deep breath. The clean, filtered air of the hospital filled my lungs. I want to write a new will. I want to write my son, Mark, out of it completely. Ms. Davis didn't flinch. She didn't look shocked or ask me if I was sure. She just nodded, her expression unreadable. I see, she said. And who will be your new beneficiary? Just then, the door swung open quietly. Sarah came in to refill my water pitcher. She didn't say a word, just smiled at me as she poured the cool water. The ice cubes clinked gently against the plastic. I watched her move, so full of simple, uncomplicated kindness. And I knew the answer. That afternoon, I began my first small test of courage. My phone, sitting on the bedside table, suddenly buzzed and lit up. Mark's face appeared on the screen, a picture from years ago when he still smiled with his eyes. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. My first instinct, born of years of habit, was to grab it, to answer, to make everything okay. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone, but instead of swiping to answer, my thumb moved over to the red Ignore button. I pressed it. The screen went dark. The buzzing stopped. A wave of pure terror washed over me, so strong it made me dizzy. What have I done? But right behind it came another feeling, something hot and wild and powerful. It was the feeling of a locked door, finally swinging open. I had said no, even if only to a machine. I spent the next few days in the hospital quietly recovering. The nurses said my numbers were improving. The food was still terrible, but I ate it. I walked the short loop of the hallway, holding onto the railing, feeling my strength slowly return. The hum of the floor polisher in the mornings became a familiar sound. Sarah and I started to talk more. Not about my son, not about the will. I asked her about her life. She told me about growing up in a small town, about the mountain of debt from nursing school. She talked about her dream of one day owning a small home with a little garden, nothing fancy. My fiancé and I are saving, she said, her eyes bright. But with these loans, it feels like we're just treading water. Listening to her, I saw a future for the house Robert and I built. A future that wasn't about entitlement or a long-distance inheritance. It was about giving a good person a foundation. It was about gratitude. It felt right, in a way nothing had for a very long time. Ms. Davis brought the papers to my hospital room the next day. They were crisp and heavy, and the room suddenly smelled of professional perfume and fresh ink, a sharp contrast to the usual scent of antiseptic and lukewarm soup. She laid them out on the rolling table that went over my bed. A new will, a living trust, and a durable power of attorney. This gives Sarah the authority to make medical and financial decisions if you can't, Ms. Davis explained, her voice calm and even. And this, she tapped the will, makes your wishes for your property clear. I picked up the will. The words were simple, but they felt like stones, each one with a weight I had not understood before. I read my son's name in the section that explained, very clearly, why he was being disinherited. It wasn't written with anger. It was written like a fact in a history book. I read it over and over, the hum of the machines in the hallway a steady rhythm behind me. It felt like I was finally correcting a story that had gone wrong a long time ago. Ms. Davis arranged for the witnesses. A young nurse with bright pink glasses and a hospital administrator in a grey suit who looked tired. They stood quietly by the window as I sat up in bed, a pillow propped behind my back. The morning sun made a warm square on my thin blanket. "Eleanor, are you signing this of your own free will?" Ms. Davis asked formally. "I am," I said, my voice clear. I took the heavy black pen she offered. It felt cool and solid in my hand. I signed my name on each line she indicated. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. Then, I picked it up again. "There's one more thing I want to add," I said. At the bottom of the last page, I wrote a single sentence in my own shaky hand. I wanted the reason to be in my own words. Then I put the pen down. A feeling washed over me, not of anger or revenge, but of simple, quiet peace. The administrator and the nurse signed as witnesses, gave me polite smiles, and left. Ms. Davis gathered the copies. "I'll have this sent by certified mail to his address in Dubai this afternoon," she said, sliding the original into a thick envelope. "He should receive it in about a week." I was discharged 2 days later. Sarah drove me home in her little Honda, which smelled faintly of vanilla air freshener. She helped me up the steps and unlocked the front door. The house was cool and quiet, filled with the familiar scent of old wood and my rose-scented potpourri. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like mine. Sarah made me a cup of tea and fluffed the pillows on my living room couch. "Just rest, Eleanor," she said gently. "I'll come by after my shift tomorrow to check on you." After she left, I sat in my favourite armchair, the one Robert and I bought 50 years ago. I watched the dust motes dance in the afternoon light. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. And then, of course, it did. The screen showed an international number. My heart gave a single hard thump. I answered. "What is this letter?" Mark's voice was like a shard of ice in my ear. "What have you done?" I didn't answer right away. I let him sit with the silence. I could hear his sharp, angry breaths from 5,000 miles away. He started shouting then, a flood of accusations. He said I was senile, that I'd been manipulated. He called Sarah a predator, a gold digger who preyed on lonely old women. "She tricked you!" he yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "You don't know what you're doing. After everything Dad and I did for you, to build that life for you." I held the phone a few inches from my ear. I looked around my living room at the pictures on the mantel. A photo of Mark on his first tricycle. A photo of Robert and me on our wedding day. The house was quiet, except for the angry, buzzing noise coming from the receiver. I let his fury pour into the room and vanish into the air, like smoke. He was a stranger, shouting from a long way off. He finally ran out of steam, his last accusation hanging in the air. There was a moment of heavy breathing. He was waiting for me to cry, to apologize, to crumble like I always did. I took a slow, steady breath. The air in my lungs felt clean and cool. "The letter is self-explanatory, Mark," I said, and my voice was perfectly calm. "The decision is final." "Mother, you will listen to me," he started. "No," I said, the words soft but solid as a stone wall. "I will not be discussing it further." And then I did something I had never done in my entire life. I hung up on my only son. My hand didn't even shake as I placed the heavy plastic receiver back into its cradle. The click it made was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The consequences began the next morning. My little tablet pinged with a new email. It was from Jennifer, my daughter-in-law. The subject line was just one word: family. I opened it. The message was short. "You've destroyed this family. Mark is your only son. After all we have done for you." Done for me? I couldn't remember the last thing they'd done besides send a digital Christmas card. I stared at her angry words on the bright screen. I felt a little tremor in my hand, but then it stopped. I moved the cursor over the little trash can icon and clicked. The email vanished. I felt nothing at all. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It wasn't a call, just a text alert from my bank. I picked it up, my reading glasses perched on my nose. It was a fraud alert. A charge for $5,000 had just been attempted from Emirates Airlines. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't hesitate. I found the number on the back of my credit card and dialed. My heart was thumping a steady, angry rhythm against my ribs. I listened to the tinny hold music, the sound of a fake orchestra playing in my ear. When a woman with a calm voice finally answered, I was ready. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I said, my own voice surprisingly clear. "I need to report my card as stolen." She asked me about the charge. Yes, the one for the airline. I did not make that purchase. I explained that my son had the number for emergencies from years ago, an emergency that never happened. The woman at the bank was very efficient. "We will cancel that charge immediately, Mrs. Vance, and we will issue you a new card." I gave her my address and thanked her. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. I had stopped a $5,000 theft with a single phone call. It was my second test of courage, and I knew I had passed. 2 days later, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, impatient sound that made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. My heart sank. It was Mark. He was standing on my porch in a tailored grey suit, looking like a stranger trying to sell me something. He smelled of expensive cologne that drifted through the doorframe. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on. "Hello, Mark," I said. "We are going to fix this, Mother," he said, not even greeting me. He pushed gently on the door, expecting me to let him in. "Let me in. We need to talk." His eyes were cold. I stood my ground, my hand firm on the edge of the door. The old wood felt solid and real. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "No, we are not." His face tightened. "Don't be ridiculous. Where is she? Where is that nurse that tricked you?" He tried to peer around me into the living room, as if he expected to find Sarah hiding behind a chair. "Sarah is my friend," I said, "and she is not here." He scoffed, a nasty, bitter sound. "This is my house," he yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet street. "My father built this house for me. The lie of it, so bold and so wrong, gave me a sudden strength. I remembered Robert, my husband, poring over blueprints at this very kitchen table, a smudge of pencil on his nose. "Your father built this house with me," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "He built it for our family. You stopped being part of it a long time ago." He took a step back, stunned by my words. Then the anger returned, flooding his face with red. "You're incompetent," he spat. "I'll get a lawyer. We'll prove you're not in your right mind. This will all be undone." He pointed a finger at me, his hand shaking with rage. I allowed myself a small, sad smile. "I have a very good lawyer, Mark. Ms. Davis. She's already prepared for that." The certainty in my voice seemed to drain the fight out of him. He just stood there, speechless. Just then, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A familiar figure was walking up my front path, her sensible shoes making a soft, crunching sound on the gravel. It was Carol from the HOA, her brow furrowed with concern, drawn by the sound of his shouting. Carol's sensible walking shoes made a soft, crunching sound on the gravel path. Her eyes, sharp as a blue jay's, darted from Mark's angry face to mine. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice tight with concern and a healthy dose of neighborhood curiosity. Mark's whole body changed. The anger drained away, replaced by a smooth, oily charm. "Just a family disagreement, Carol. You know how it is." He smiled, a flash of white teeth that didn't reach his eyes. I kept my hand on the doorframe, steadying myself. I looked right at Carol, my neighbor of 20 years, the woman who brought in my trash cans and gossiped about everyone's lawn. "This man is trespassing," I said, my voice as calm as a summer morning. "I would like him to leave my property." The silence that followed was heavy. The social truth of my words, spoken in front of the neighborhood's biggest gossip, hit Mark like a slap. His charming smile curdled. He left, sputtering threats about lawyers and my fading mind. The door closed behind him with a quiet, final click. I turned to Carol, who was staring, her mouth a perfect little O. "Would you like some iced tea?" I asked, as if I were inviting her in after a church potluck. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from a fancy law firm in Dubai. I didn't even open it. I just drove it over to Ms. Davis's office. She called me that afternoon. "He has no case, Eleanor," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. It's all noise. The revenge was done, and it had been utterly quiet. My new life began with a stack of paper. The Medicare forms I had shoved in a drawer felt like a mountain I had to climb alone. I spread them out on my kitchen table, the scent of lemon polish faintly in the air. Sarah came over that Saturday with a thermos of coffee and a highlighter. "Let's tackle this beast," she said, rolling up her sleeves. We sat there for hours, side by side. She explained what Part D was and why a supplemental plan made sense with my fixed income. She didn't make me feel old or stupid. She made me feel like a partner. For the first time in years, sitting at that table, I felt completely capable. The next week, I met with Ms. Davis again. The fluorescent lights of her office hummed softly overhead. I didn't tell Sarah what I was doing. I didn't want her to feel beholden to me. I set up a small trust with a simple instruction. Pay the full remaining balance of Sarah Jenkins's student loan debt, I wrote on the form. The check would be sent directly to the loan company. There would be no grand announcement, no tearful thank you. The joy was in the giving, a quiet act of planting a seed in someone else's garden. It was a secret I planned to keep. I started joining the world again. Our church had a community garden project tucked behind the fellowship hall. I signed up. The first day, my back ached and my knees complained, but my hands in the cool, dark earth felt right. The sun was warm on my neck. I learned the names of the other women. We talked about fertilizer and pests, not about our children. They knew me only as Eleanor, the woman whose tomatoes were surprisingly sweet. One afternoon, after a long day of weeding, I came home to find a crisp, white envelope from the HOA in my mailbox. It was an anonymous complaint about my unkempt rose bushes. I knew exactly who had filed it. Instead of getting out my rusty clippers, I called a landscaping company I'd seen working on a house down the street. 2 days later, a truck pulled up. The men were polite and worked all day in the sun. They didn't just trim the roses. They put in a beautiful stone border, laid down fresh mulch that smelled like cedar, and planted bright yellow daylilies along the walkway. When they finished, my front yard looked like something out of a magazine. That afternoon, I sat down at my kitchen table with a new box of stationery. I wrote a short, sweet note to the HOA board. "Dear Committee," it said, "thank you so much for the recent notice. It was just the inspiration I needed to refresh the property's look. Sincerely, Eleanor Vance." I knew Carol would read it aloud at the next meeting. A week later, Sarah stopped by after her shift at the hospital. She looked pale. She walked onto my porch and just stood there, holding a letter. I offered her a glass of iced tea, but she shook her head. Her hands were trembling. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What did you do?" She held out the letter. It was from the Federal Student Loan Service. I didn't need to read it. She sank onto the porch swing, and the tears finally came. "It's all gone," she sobbed into her hands. "All of it. My debt. It's paid." I sat down next to her, the old chains of the swing groaning softly. I just put my arm around her shoulder. After a long time, she looked up at me, her eyes red. "You've given me a future." I patted her arm. "No, dear," I said, my voice steady. "You gave me my present back." The next project was the garage. For 15 years, my late husband Robert's old Lincoln had been sitting under a dusty cover. It was a beautiful car, but all it did was take up space and remind me of Mark's words every time he visited. "Don't you ever sell that car, Mum. That's mine." I called a classic car dealer. He came over, looked it over, and made me a fair offer right on the spot. It was a surprisingly large number. The sound of the Lincoln's engine starting up for the last time echoed in the garage, and then it was gone. The space felt enormous. That afternoon, I called Carol. "How do you feel about glaciers?" I asked her. There was a pause. "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" she said. "I'm talking about an Alaskan cruise," I told her. "I just sold a very large piece of metal, and I'm using the money to see some very large pieces of ice." She let out a whoop so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. The air in Alaska was so clean, it felt like a brand new invention. I stood on the deck of the ship, wrapped in a wool blanket, and watched chunks of blue ice carve off a glacier. The sound was like thunder rolling across the water. Carol was next to me, taking 100 pictures with her phone. I was surrounded by people my age, laughing and pointing and just living. I realized how much of my life I'd spent in a quiet house, waiting for a phone call, waiting for a visit, waiting for a crumb of attention. I had made my world so small. From the gift shop, I bought a postcard of a bald eagle. I wrote a quick note to my church group about the mountains and the wonderful food. I put a stamp on it and dropped it in the ship's mailbox. Later that night, back in my cabin, I saw a missed call on my phone, an international number. I looked at it for a moment, then I pressed the button to delete it without ever listening to the message. When I got home, the house felt different. It was my house. I walked into the kitchen and looked at my old, sputtering coffee maker. The next day, I went to the department store and bought a fancy new one that ground the beans and had a little clock on it. The first cup I made filled the whole kitchen with the rich, dark smell of good coffee. It was a simple thing, but it felt like a revolution. I started doing more things like that. I bought a subscription to a streaming service so I could watch the British mysteries I loved whenever I wanted. I stopped buying the cheapest cut of meat at the grocery store and started getting the good chicken. Each small purchase wasn't about spending money. It was about deciding I was worth it. I was worth a good cup of coffee. I was worth a comfortable evening. I was worth a decent meal. I was finally investing in myself. Sarah invited me to her family's Thanksgiving a few weeks later. My first instinct was to say no. I didn't want to intrude. "Nonsense," she said over the phone, her voice firm but kind. "My mother is already fighting with my aunt over who gets to make the sweet potato casserole. We need a neutral party." I was so nervous when I walked up to her parents' front door, holding my pumpkin pie like a shield. The door flew open before I could ring the bell. A whirlwind of noise and warmth pulled me inside. The air smelled thick with turkey and cinnamon. A football game blared from a television in the living room, and a little boy chased a giggling toddler through the hallway. Sarah's mother, a woman with the same warm eyes as her daughter, gave me a hug that felt like a real welcome. At the dinner table, I was seated between Sarah and her father. He asked me about my garden. Her cousins asked about my Alaska cruise. No one asked about Mark. I sat there, at a noisy table full of laughter and life, and realized it was the first real Thanksgiving I'd had in a decade. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. After that day, I started to see my house differently. It wasn't just a collection of memories and a future asset for my son. It was my home, for my life, right now. I decided to make a change I'd wanted for years. I called a contractor about the master bathroom. "The tub is just too high for me to step into safely," I told the young man who came to give me an estimate. "I want it gone. I want a walk-in shower with a bench and a good grab bar." He nodded, taking notes. "We can do that, Mom. Make it safer and easier for you." For a week, the house was filled with the smell of sawdust and the sound of hammers. I didn't mind. It was the sound of progress. When they were finished, I stood in the doorway and just looked. The new tiles gleamed. There were no more floral shower curtains, just a clean, clear glass door. That evening, I took my first shower in it. The simple luxury of sitting on the built-in bench with the hot water streaming down felt more valuable than any inheritance. It was a practical change, but it felt like a profound one. A few days before my 71st birthday, a card arrived in the mail. The envelope was a pale blue, addressed in unfamiliar looping handwriting. I opened it carefully. It was a generic card from the grocery store, with 3 cartoon kittens on the front. It was from my granddaughter, Lucy. Inside, the printed message said, "Happy birthday to a special grandma." But underneath, in that same looping script, she had written just 4 words. "I'm sorry, Grandma." I sat at my kitchen table, tracing the words with my finger. It was the first contact I'd had from Mark's family that wasn't filled with anger or demands. It was just an apology. I didn't know what for, exactly. For her father's behavior? For her own silence? I felt a complicated knot in my chest, a mix of old love and new caution. I didn't know how to feel, or what I was supposed to do with it. The next morning, I took out my good stationery, the cream-coloured paper with the small E at the top. I picked up my favourite fountain pen, the one Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. The ink was a deep blue. I thought for a long time about what to write. I decided the truth was the simplest path. I didn't mention Mark. I didn't mention the inheritance or the anger. I wrote about the new walk-in shower and how much easier it made my mornings. I told her about the prize my tomatoes won at the church fair and how Carol and I were already planning another cruise, maybe to the Caribbean this time. At the very end, I added a single line. "If you ever just want to talk, you have my number." I sealed the envelope and walked it down to the corner mailbox myself. It felt like I was sending a little paper boat out into a big ocean, with no idea if it would ever reach a shore. Sarah came over that weekend, her face glowing. She practically danced into my kitchen, holding out her left hand. A small, perfect diamond sparkled on her finger. I gasped, pulling her into a hug as she laughed. "He asked me last night," she said, her voice filled with happy tears. "We're getting married in the spring." We sat on the porch swing with glasses of iced tea while she told me all about it. The restaurant, the way he got down on one knee, the plans they were already making. My heart felt full, watching her. Then she turned to me, her expression suddenly serious. "Eleanor," she said, taking my hand, "I know this is a lot to ask, but you feel like family to me. Would you be my matron of honor?" I looked at her, this wonderful young woman who had held my hand in a hospital room and brought me back to life in so many ways. The joy I felt was pure, a mother's joy, but without the heavy weight of obligation or history. It was a gift, freely given. For the first time in years, I had a truly happy event to plan for. I decided my husband Robert's legacy needed to be about more than just a stock portfolio. It needed to have a heart. I called Ms. Davis and told her my idea. She found the right person for me at the local community college, a kind woman with a warm handshake. We sat in a small, tidy office that smelled of old books and floor polish. "I'd like to start a scholarship," I said, "for nursing students." "That's wonderful, Mrs. Vance," the woman said. "Do you have a name in mind for it?" I looked down at the paperwork she'd given me. The Robert Vance Memorial Scholarship for Compassionate Care. Saying it out loud made it real. It felt right. My husband's name would now help build futures, not just fund my son's anger. His legacy was finally clean. One rainy Tuesday, I decided to tackle the boxes in the attic. The air up there was thick with the smell of cedar and dust. I found my old wedding dress, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, and a box of Robert's old work ties. Tucked at the bottom of a trunk was a faded manila envelope. Inside was my husband's original will. I hadn't looked at it in years. It left everything to me, of course. But at the very end, in his familiar, strong handwriting, he had added a note. It said, "To my Eleanor, I trust you completely." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I sat on the dusty floor, holding the paper to my chest, and felt a wave of love for him so strong it was like he was right there with me. I had honored his trust. I had done the right thing. Just then, the phone rang downstairs, a shrill, insistent sound. I wiped my eyes, went down to the kitchen, and saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. A young, shaky voice said, "Grandma?" It was my granddaughter, Lucy. She sounded so much older than I remembered. "Hi, honey," I said, my voice softer than I expected. "It's good to hear from you." I just, I wanted to see how you were," she said. There was a long pause, the sound of static filling the space between us. "Dad he's angry all the time now, about everything." I sank into my kitchen chair, the smooth wood cool against my back. I listened as she spoke, her words tumbling out in a quiet rush. She talked about the tension in their house, the way her father slammed doors and spoke in a low, bitter tone. I didn't offer any advice. I didn't say a word against my son. I just listened, letting her empty her heart. When she was finished, there was another silence. I finally knew what I needed to do next. The next morning, I was back in Ms. Davis's office. The leather chair felt familiar and safe. "I need to make another change," I told her. "A small one." She nodded, her pen ready. "Of course, Eleanor. What did you have in mind?" "I want to create a small trust for my grandchildren," I said, "to be paid out when they turn 30. It's not a fortune, just enough to help with a down payment or to pay off some bills." Ms. Davis smiled a little. "I think that's a lovely idea." It was my way of sending a message across the ocean, one that couldn't be twisted or misinterpreted. My fight was with their father's choices, not with them. I was separating the man's behavior from the children he had raised. It was a final, quiet sorting of what was right and what was wrong. 5 years to the day after my heart attack, I was sitting on my front porch swing. The chains made a gentle, rhythmic creak. Sarah was next to me, her hands resting on her round, pregnant belly. The afternoon sun was warm on our faces, and the air smelled like freshly cut grass from my neighbor's yard. We didn't talk about what day it was. We didn't need to. We just watched the cars pass by, and I felt the gentle weight of her leaning against me. My house was quiet. My heart was steady. I looked at this kind young woman who was giving my name to her daughter, and I felt a peace so deep it settled into my bones. I hosted a Christmas Eve party that year. It wasn't a big, fancy affair, just my chosen family. Sarah and her husband came, their faces glowing with excitement for the baby on the way. Carol from the HOA brought her famous 7-layer dip and promised not to talk about rogue garbage cans. A few of my friends from the church garden project filled the living room with gentle laughter. The house smelled of pine needles from the tree and the glazed ham I'd pulled from the oven. Soft carols played from the little speaker on the counter. "Eleanor, this punch is divine," Carol said, holding up her glass. "What's your secret?" I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. "Just a little Christmas spirit, Carol, and a splash of cranberry juice." Later, as people were leaving, Sarah's husband took my hand. "Thank you for having us, Eleanor. he said. "This is the best Christmas Eve." I looked around the quiet room after they had all gone, at the stray napkin and the half-empty cookie plate. My house was filled with warmth and memories of happy voices. It finally felt truly blessed. A few weeks into the new year, a thick, formal-looking letter arrived, forwarded from Ms. Davis's office. I set it on the kitchen table and poured my morning coffee before I opened it. The paper felt heavy and official. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to get louder in the silence. It was a notification of divorce proceedings. Mark and Jennifer. I read through the dry legal language. In the documents, Jennifer cited his obsessive anger over his lost inheritance as a primary cause for the breakdown of their marriage. I felt a quiet wave of sadness roll over me, but there was no guilt. It was the kind of sadness you feel when you see a tree fall in a storm. It was a natural, inevitable thing. I folded the papers and put them back in the envelope. I wouldn't need to read them again. That afternoon, I looked out the window at the first brave crocuses pushing up through the cold soil. Some things end, and some things begin. In early spring, Sarah had her baby, a beautiful, healthy little girl with a dusting of dark hair. Sarah called me from the hospital, her voice tired but full of pure joy. "Can you come visit?" she asked. "There's someone who wants to meet you." I held the tiny baby in my arms in that sterile white room. She was wrapped in a soft pink blanket and smelled of milk and powder. She was so light, yet she felt like the most important thing in the world. "She's just perfect, Sarah," I whispered, my voice thick. Sarah smiled from her hospital bed. "We wanted her to have a strong name," she said softly. "We named her Eleanor." I looked down at the tiny, sleeping face, at little Eleanor. I held her in my arms, in the house Mark thought was his, and I finally understood the true meaning of legacy. It's not about the things you leave behind. It's the love you plant in the world. A few days after I met baby Eleanor, I was sitting at my desk, and I saw the last birthday card my granddaughter had sent me. It was still on the mantelpiece. I picked it up and ran my thumb over her hesitant handwriting. An idea took root in my mind. I called my lawyer the next morning. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked steadily as the phone rang. "Ms. Davis, it's Eleanor Vance," I said when she answered. "I'd like to make a small change to my will. A codicil, I believe it's called." "Of course, Eleanor. What did you have in mind?" Her voice was calm and professional. "It's about my granddaughter," I said, looking at the card. "I want to grant her the right to choose one item from my home as a keepsake after I'm gone. Just one thing to remember me by." It was a final act of grace, the last loose end of my heart that needed to be tied. I am in my garden now, most evenings. Last night, I was watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah was next to me on the porch swing, gently rocking little Eleanor. My hands were stained with good, rich soil from planting new rose bushes. I could feel the last bit of warmth from the fading sun on my face. "It's a beautiful evening," Sarah said quietly, so as not to wake the baby. I smiled, looking out at the world I had built for myself. "They all are," I said, "if you take the time to look." I looked at my home, solid and peaceful. I looked at Sarah, my friend, my chosen daughter. I looked at the precious new life sleeping in her arms. And I knew, with a certainty that filled my entire soul, that I had chosen wisely. Presence is so much more valuable than blood.